Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. On behalf of Columbia Global Center Mumbai, I'm delighted to welcome you today to today's webinar on From Decarbonization to Adaptation, India's Climate Agenda for COP30. My name is Rachna Tahilyani and I work with the Mumbai Center. We're a team, we're a part of Columbia Global, a university-wide initiative that brings together Columbia's most dynamic global-facing entities, including the Global Centers, the Committee on Global Thought, Columbia World Projects, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, and Columbia Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. Columbia Global's mission is to address pressing global challenges through groundbreaking scholarly pursuits, research, leadership development, and projects that create social impact. The global centers are central to this vision, bridging local wisdom with global perspectives to create spaces for mutual learning and dialogue. Today's discussion is part of the Road to COP30, Local Voices and Global Pathway series, which leverages this global network to convene perspectives from around the world in the lead up to COP30 in Brazil this November. The series travels virtually from Beijing to Rio, with each conversation highlighting local climate debates and their connection to global negotiations. The series started last week in Beijing, where we explored China's role in climate investments. Next week, the American Center will discuss Jordan's path to COP30. Today, our focus is on India, its climate priorities and expectations from COP30. We're honored to have with us Kavitha Iyer as the moderator. Kavitha is an award-winning journalist with over 2 decades of experience covering marginalized communities and the author of Landscapes of Loss, the story of an Indian drought. With that, I warmly welcome Kavitha and our distinguished speakers and thank all of you for joining us. Kavitha, over to you.
Hello, I am delighted to welcome all of you to this discussion on what India can expect from COP30. We know it's a crucial opportunity for India to advocate for its climate leadership, to champion climate justice, particularly for the developing world, to strengthen our domestic carbon markets, secure global climate finance, and also to see how well we are all aligned with the Paris commitments. And to take us through this key discussion ahead of Belém is we have 3 eminent speakers today. Gives me great joy to introduce them to you. We'll start with Sumit Prasad. He is program lead for climate negotiations at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Sumit works in climate change and the energy sector, particularly in relation to developing policy and governance. His most recent work is in relation to examining capacity building, transparency, and accountability under the UNFCCC. Our second speaker will be Avantika Goswami, who is program manager for climate change at the Center for Science and Environment. She has over a decade's experience in climate and economic research and in sustainability program management. At CSE, she's been leading the Institute's climate policy research and advocacy, spanning climate finance, mitigation.
Kavitha, you're on mute.
Have I been on mute from the start?
No, just the last 2-3 sentences.
Okay, I think somebody muted me. Okay, anyway, so I will reintroduce Avantika Goswami. Apologies about that. Avantika is program manager for climate change at the Center for Science and Environment. She has over a decade's experience in climate and economic research and sustainability program management. At CSE, she's been leading the Institute's climate policy, research, and advocacy. Spanning climate finance, mitigation, carbon markets, methane, forest-based mitigation, trade, and also all negotiations, tracking of the negotiations of the UNFCCC. She has represented CSE at all COP summits since 2021. Delighted to have you here, Avantika. And finally, our third speaker will be Professor Ruth DeFries. somebody I'm a personal big fan of, and she's been working for more than 4 decades on issues related to land use, biodiversity, ecology, and the commons, viewing all of this from the lens of what is sustainable development really. She works extensively with communities in the central Indian forest region, and her research has been instructive to many, many researchers, journalists, students, and policymakers. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us and for giving us this roadmap to Belém. We'll start with Sumit. Each of our speakers will go one after the other. We'll give each of them 10 minutes to set the context for us, and then we'll probably come back and see whether we have follow-up questions for them or whether we should throw it open to questions from all of you joining us today. Sumit, we'll start with you. If you could possibly talk about what does accountability mean for the developed world with regard to commitments on climate. We know that India's energy transition, for example, is this huge balancing act that we are having to do between development needs and climate commitments. And from this standpoint, do you think that India can possibly leverage our international partnerships to push for better mechanisms, more robust frameworks to guarantee better accountability from the developed world? Sumit, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kavitha. Thanks, the Columbia Global Institute for this kind invite. I think it's very timely that to have this discussion surrounding the COP30 is just nearing just about a month or so. Yeah, so just on the accountability bit, I think the debate on, if you look at the climate debate, which is going on since last more than 3 decades now, the very basic about the debate on accountability is about who should do what. If I may just go briefly a little bit back when all this was adopted within the CCC in 1994, the main purpose of this entire conference was to stabilize the greenhouse gas emissions, which were as a result of the man-made emissions, and that was actually impacting the environment to a large scale. And there were two key principles that was really facilitating these two aspects. The first principle was the developed countries to take the onus of these climate mitigation efforts. And the second principle was that the developing countries.
I'm sorry, could you please mute yourselves, those of you who are not speaking? Only Sumit would be speaking right now. Thank you.
Thanks. So the second principle was about supporting developing countries in this transition to their greener economy and everything else in form of finance, in form of capacity building, in form of technology transfer, and everything else. Now, these two principles forms the basis of undertaking climate actions within the convention since 1994. And then there was series of agreements on how they moved on. And if you look at these two defined principles, right, what it forms is the common but differentiated responsibility in light of respective capabilities for the climate actions to be taken. And equity becomes the center of this thing, right? Now, what is happening, the first agreement was of the Kyoto Protocol, within which the developed countries were asked to kind of, to reduce 5% of their emissions with regards to the 90% baseline. But if you talk about the accountability there themselves, right, we didn't see, enough commitment from the developed countries to be able to meet that target itself. Canada withdrew from that agreement just to, save itself from the penalties. US did not even commit to it. It's not that the US is not committing today. There's a history of US not committing in the entire free agreements itself, right? Moving forward, when we look into the amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, just because US was not there, Japan and other major countries also did not agree to the Doha amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, right? So the 18% reduction of the target was under the question mark whether the countries really delivered something, the developed countries really delivered something on an account of it, right? Just to kind of bring to this picture, right? While all this was happening, there was a continuous push by the global north to kind of bridge that debate of or to bridge that basic principles of the convention, that the owners of the developing countries and the capacity building, and bring and increase that basket to the developing countries as well. So the principle of equity, the principle of CBDR was getting diluted as we progress within negotiations, and the accountability was like not just kind of being limited to the developing countries, but the global north was shifting to the developing countries as well. And hence, as a result, under the Paris Agreement, we talked about the national determined contributions, which was much more driven. The commitments were much more driven by the countries themselves. Now, even in that particular aspect, you talk about how the commitments look like at presently. None of these commitments are ambitious enough to be, while few European countries are doing really great in that particular space, but none of these countries are leading to 1.5 degree scenario, which is needed for us to be there in a safer, in a safer space, right? Just to comment on this accountability of the climate actions, right? How does it actually being measured in terms in this entire negotiation space? Countries come and they submit their biennial reports or the biennial transparency report under the Paris Agreement. They say what they have done, right? They just say that, but nobody actually kinds of points of that what you have not done. So there is no kind of, an actual accountability of what is not being done. So it's just a process accountability to submit the report, but not an actual, obligation of not being able to achieve. There's no repercussion. There's no, because the Paris Agreement is non-punitive in nature in particular, that's it, right? And so is the global stocktake process, which is a part of the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to be collectively informing the where we are progressing. It's just a collective progress of the efforts that has happened in at COP28, where all these global stocktake process happened. The amount of effort it took the world to kind of arrive as an outcome of the global stocktake process was huge. But if you look at the outcome of it, what have we seen so far? The third iteration of the NDCs, the commitments that the countries have to come, should have been there in place, right? But only 40 countries have submitted those updated NDCs, and that two NDCs are just leading to 2.5 degree scenarios per se. So certainly there is absolutely missing accountability in this entire space of the climate regime, and the accountability within the negotiation forum is really, really process oriented rather than action oriented to deliver on something. So I'll just pause here. I think there's too much information that might have come in, but I'm happy to answer any questions that that you have. Yeah.
Sumit, before we take Avantika's opening thoughts, very, very sobering thoughts from you. Thank you for that. Really setting out what's not being taken note of and what's not being measured, and why we should be taking note of those things. Do you also want to talk a little bit about how these measurements and on economic damages, etc., how these measurements are being done in developing countries, what improvements we can hope for in the coming years?
Yeah. Thanks, Kavitha. I think there are many parts to it, right? The measurement and the processes of a domestic actions is very different than the measurement that has to be presented internationally, right? So within the international frameworks and structures, there are national communication and biennial reports that a country has to submit to UNFCCC, which is then followed through a facilitative process where where a technical expert would come and review those reports, followed by a facilitated consideration where they just come and discuss, okay, what you have presented, what has been the challenges. That's it. And then they move on with the closing of that particular report. So that's how the international reporting happens, right? But domestically, how we do it, there are various schemes and the policies that have been taken care by individual ministry line, and they report annually. What we are trying to say is that you don't have to report internationally, but then you need to understand what has been the impact of the policy domestically. So there is a need for you to understand how your policies have performed, so that you can better develop your policies in the moving forward. And that should actually reflect in developing your international reports per se, because these international reporting obligations are very, very complex. They ask about 60 comprehensive tables with 50,000 data points, which a developing country like India and everybody else, I don't think there has to be so much amount of focus needs to be there, where the challenges are very, very different at present, right? We need to kind of address the grassroots challenges rather than go ahead and start gathering those minute level data. But yes, we need to identify, we need to track, understand how our policies are performing domestically, and that is where we need to take it forward and project it better internationally.
Thank you, Sumit. We'll move on to Avantika now. We'll come back to you, Sumit. We do have questions about your area of expertise. We'll come back to you, but we'll move on to Avantika right now. Avantika, just to remind all our participants today, Avantika is a program manager for climate change at the CSE, and she has actually represented the CSE at every single UNFCCC negotiation since 2021. Avantika, after a sort of eye-opening set of context-setting statements from Sumit, Would you want to take on a question about how do you see India angling for a role in asking for a leading role in ensuring that climate finance actually begins to serve the needs of the global South? We know that developing countries need not billions but trillions in climate finance, and also that ideally these should come as grants, not debt. Do you see that India can push back at COP30 against the developed nations dodging regarding their commitments? Avantika.
Thanks, Kavitha, and thanks to the organizers also to, for putting together this great discussion. Nice to engage once again with my alma mater also. Um, so I think Sumit's comments were extremely enlightening because accountability is, of course, a very central issue in this entire process. It's kind of at the core of this whole climate governance architecture. But another sort of core pillar is the question of money and financing. And I think I'll step back briefly before I actually dive into that to just talk about broadly what are we expecting this year at COP30 in Belem, and what might India be expecting. I, of course, can't speak for the official delegation, but based on our understanding and interactions and also our own analysis. So it's definitely a strange year because I think previous years recently at the COP summits have had a specific target to achieve. So COP28 was the culmination of the first global stocktake. COP29 was the finalizing of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. This year, there isn't one header issue at COP30, but a number of pressing issues ranging from the Just Transition Work Program to the question of where we take the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, to indicators being developed for the global goal on adaptation and so on. But the finance issue doesn't have a specific decision or resolution that is due at COP30, but it is looming large, I can tell you, across the entire COP process, and also across the larger question of decarbonization for developing countries. So a quick reminder, what happened last year at COP29 at Azerbaijan was the agreement of kind of a dual climate finance target. There was a core goal of $300 billion agreed annually to be transferred to developing countries, nested within a larger goal of $1.3 trillion to be mobilized annually, again, for decarbonization in developing countries. And many saw this as a win because it was a very fraught set of negotiations. And we were, of course, we were there on the ground, and there were fears that there wouldn't be a decisive outcome because of the tensions and the kind of wide spectrum of views on this particular topic. But a decision was arrived at. Was it a transformative decision that is truly serving the needs of developing countries? I mean, our view as CSC is that it was not, for many, many reasons, because climate finance was iterated previously around 2009 at previous COPs as a first initial goal of $100 billion per year from developed to developing countries. And many lessons were learned in agreeing that previous target. So lessons such as no specificity about whether money should be transferred in the form of debt or in the form of grant-based funding. There was no specificity about how much money should go towards mitigation, towards adaptation, towards loss and damage. So all of these kind of issues had been bubbling up over the course of the decade or so that the 100 billion target was in focus. Now, when the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, it was decided that by 2025, a new climate finance target would be agreed upon. And it wasn't just about the quantum or amount of money that is agreed. It's about all of these qualitative specifics that would really ensure that high quality, accessible finance is available to developing countries that takes into account all of the problems and subordination within the global financial architecture, and a goal is agreed that kind of offers something real, real money on the table. this is where Baku really failed. This is where last year COP29 was a huge disappointment, because for various very tense political and somewhat technical reasons, there wasn't a specification about how much money comes as grant-based funding, how much comes as debt-based funding. So essentially, market rate loans or debt issued from developed country financiers to developing countries could be considered as climate finance. But what the analysis is showing actually is that if you look at the numbers for sovereign debt today held by developing countries, many developing countries are actually paying huge amounts in interest repayments to developed country financiers. So as a result, what you're getting is net negative finance flows, which really makes something like commercial loans very, very problematic to be counted as climate finance. So hence there was this entire push around detailing out what a good qualitative finance goal should look like, and Baku did not achieve that. Where are we after that? Very briefly, and I'll come to India very quickly, I promise. Once the goal was agreed, now is the question of operationalizing it and implementing it. So this year, there is a process that has been envisioned called the Baku to Belem roadmap. It's kind of self-explanatory, wherein between Baku last year to Belem this year, the Brazilian COP presidency is trying to figure out how you actually mobilize this 300 billion and 1.3 trillion in the coming decade. And for this process, they've been doing consultations, they've been inviting submissions from NGOs, academia, from governments. And we have also been quite actively engaged in this Baku to Belem roadmap to figure out what should be the sources of money for this 300 billion and 1.3 trillion goal. The conversation has been quite broad right now. It has not simply been about governments providing money to governments. It's also been about domestic resource mobilization within developing countries. It has also been about different types of taxes and levies based on various proposals for, let's say, a tax on private jets or a tax on fossil fuel profits. There has been a big conversation about what role the private sector should play in this mobilization of the goal, and how can private capital really be brought into places where the money is not reaching right now. So now coming to India. India has played a very sort of prominent role in these debates. The Ministry of Finance has been represented throughout the negotiation process. And interestingly, last year, when in the lead up to the Baku outcome, in the months leading up, India was among the first few countries to propose to put a number on the table to say that we demand $1 trillion from developed countries to developing countries every year. Whereas developed countries up until then, in the months leading up to Baku, kind of held their cards close to their chest and didn't really talk about what kind of quantum they are going to be comfortable with. But India really led the way on that. Once the Baku outcome was gavelled, India was among the few countries who actually called out the outcome as being very, very inadequate and expressed disappointment in the process. And very interestingly, this year, actually, India has been very clear that, and I'm going to get into a technical specification for a minute here, but India has been actually uplifting and spotlighting the issue of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which really focuses on the obligation of developed country governments to provide financing to developing countries through public money. So at the bond negotiations in June this year, India made Article 9.1 a big priority. They wanted to actually make it a part of the official conference agenda, which means that once it becomes an agenda item, it has to be discussed in great detail. That was unsuccessful. It was blocked by the European Union at Bonn and, of course, other allied parties. But India and other developing countries might pick up Article 9.1 once again at Belem. And just to wrap up, I think India has been very vocal on the need to ensure high quality finance flows to developing countries, picking up very contentious issues like figuring out a definition of climate finance. And they've been raising these discussions through the Standing Committee on Finance. Of course, very contentious issues like Article 9.1. So the hope is that a country with the kind of presence and weight that India has, taking the lead on these issues, will precipitate something useful. So that's still to be seen. So I'll pause here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Avantika. We're going to take some opening comments from Ruth before we come back to Sumit and to Avantika. Ruth, as you know, has more than 4 decades of experience working with the voices of people whose opinions on much of this is almost never heard. And so I'm very keen to bring Ruth into this discussion from that point of view. Uh, is there is there an intersection? There is an intersection between India's climate commitments and ecology, whether it is whether it's forests or whether it's farmlands. Is there a way, Ruth, for India to strike a balance between conserving ecosystems and ensuring that the millions who have livelihoods dependent on these forests and farmlands are able to continue living dignified lives and living more dignified lives? Do you think that there is a conflict there at all, or do you think that it's something that we need to work towards, Ruth?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you to the Mumbai Global Center and Kavitha and everyone who has joined this conversation. And thanks for the opportunity to be a part of it. So before I get to your specific question, Kavitha, I just want to back up a little bit and reflect on the comments from Sumit and Avantika that are very sobering and given us the reality that the commitments are inadequate for mitigation. And even if they were to be met, and even if there were to be accountability, we are still facing serious climate change. And that climate change is with us now, today, right now. And we are seeing that on the ground, and people are living that experience. And that brings us to the adaptation question and the very real needs for funding for adaptation, whether that's coastal flood protection, early warning systems for extreme events. We've seen how impactful those are. There's examples from India, health facilities for heat wave victims. There are very real and specific needs for adaptation funding. And India has been such a strong voice and a leader on making this point a staunch voice for adaptation funding, for loss and damage, for the funding to come from those countries that have been historically responsible for the emissions. So I expect that that to continue in Belém at COP30, and in my opinion, quite rightly so. So now to your question about the ecosystems, conserving ecosystems versus versus ensuring livelihoods. And I will just take the view that these are not at all in conflict. In fact, the opposite. We can't have viable livelihoods without healthy ecosystems. We can't have a healthy economy without the ecosystems that support them, particularly in a country like India, which is so dependent, and so many livelihoods are dependent on, directly dependent on ecosystems. So I'll just reflect on 2 examples. You can cut me off if I'm taking up too much time, Kavitha. And one is in the urban context and urban ecosystems. And, you know, we've seen serious heat waves in particularly in urban areas in India and elsewhere around the world. And if you spend any time outside during those heat waves, you will quickly realize that it's very hard to work outside during a heat wave. And those many, many, many millions of people who work in the informal sector and have no access to air conditioning, cannot afford to miss a day of work, these heat waves have very serious consequences. We also know, abundant evidence, that green spaces in urban areas are very impactful for reducing temperatures, and that having some green space can drastically alleviate some of the effects of these heat waves. And we know this from many places around the world. So healthy ecosystems in an urban context, green spaces are really critical for urban livelihoods.
Yes, it's Mighty Puffs. I know I've seen it.
So
requesting
yeah,
everyone once again to please mute yourselves. Thank you. Sorry, Professor Ruth, please continue.
Yeah, sure. So a second example from the rural context, and agriculture we know is the backbone of livelihoods in India. And we've seen in this monsoon season itself, the impact of flooding, the flooding in Punjab, the flooding in Himachal and the Himalayan region. And what a big economic loss that causes from destroying crops, affecting the movement of people and goods. So these floods are very, very impactful. And the more intense rainfall becomes, which is predicted to become more and more intense, and we've seen that already, the more catastrophic these events will become. So these intense rainfall, there's absolutely a causal factor from climate change, from increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But there's also the aspect of healthy ecosystems to mitigate some of the stream flow, having healthy vegetation, particularly in the floodplains. And we know in the upper reaches, we have hard infrastructure that is making those floods, the water just getting channeled down and exacerbating those floods. This is not an excuse for continued emissions of greenhouse gases, but just to reflect on the kind of adaptation investments that can alleviate some of the real impacts of climate change that we're seeing, and the need for funding for those kinds of investments.
Ruth, that's a great way for us to actually stop looking at these negotiations as something abstruse happening out there that's not really related to what's happening in our backyard. Thank you for doing that, for really connecting those dots between something that's happening either in Paris or in Baku or in Belém with what's happening in Himachal, what's happening in Punjab, and what's happening right now as we speak in the towns and cities that we're living in. I want to ask you one more small question before we open this up for questions from all our participants. You're working so closely with marginalized communities. How do we bring their voices into climate negotiations, and what lessons has your research shown us on how it's possible to integrate these voices into climate negotiations?
Yeah, well, this is hard because there is a very big gulf between the what happens at the COPs and what happens on the ground. So even if you bring some voices from the ground to the COP, it can tend to be performative, and what's the real impact on the ground? So I think myself, I like to focus on thinking about really what happens on the ground and how to think about what happens at the COPs as helping livelihoods, helping adaptation, helping mitigation to the extent that it can. And I just want to reflect on one thing. I've been working for the last several years on the question of millets in India, particularly the small millets, and how they can improve climate resilience, nutrition, and all of the wonderful things that I'm sure everybody knows about. If you are joining us from India, which I think a lot of you are today, you will know that millets there's been a sea change in thinking about these climate resilient traditional cereals that have fed humanity for so long, particularly in drier areas. And India is the largest producer of millets in the world, despite the decline over the last decades. So the government has very much leaned into this. And I think that is something that can be taken to COP to show that there are real efforts that can bring climate resilience, also some climate mitigation, and make improvements to nutrition. And this, in my opinion, should be a real source of pride for India to bring to the global stage, and connect the reality of people's lives on the ground, which is a need for climate resilience, for better nutrition in the many small scale farmers in India, and connect that with the lofty discussions that will be happening in Belém.
Right. Ruth, I think one of the first questions that we have is ideally suited for you, and perhaps we can also ask if Avantika will pitch in as well to answer this question. We have a question from Rachel A. Before I read out the question, inviting everyone who's participating to post their questions in the chat box, and we can take as many questions as we have time for. We'll go with the first one. The question is from Rachel. What are the numbers, and how much climate funding do we really require to make specifically agriculture sustainable? What will it cost to make India fully organic? Because small farmers cannot afford to take a 10% loss of produce, which would naturally come with going chemical free or organic. This is particularly a question that is focusing on Indian agricultural systems. Ruth, if you want to take that, and then Avantika, if you want to also add your thoughts to that. Ruth.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question, Rachel. I'm not sure I can give you a number, but I'll try to give you an answer, and Avantika may have a better handle on the precise numbers about investments in sustainable agriculture. But I will say there are some examples coming from India where there has been investment, not enormous investment, and that investment leading to positive outcomes on the ground. I'm thinking particularly around the Orissa Millet Mission, which some of you may know about, which has an investment of, I'd have to look it up, it's crores, it's significant, but it's not, unrealistic because it has actually happened. So I would say that the real important issue is, of course, the funding and the investment, but at least as importantly, the organizational structure and the institutions to connect that funding to real change on the ground. So we see this in the Orissa Millet Mission. It's gotten some international awards for having a very clear strategy to increase production of millets, increase consumption of millets, a very tiered strategy to connect all along the scales from state government down to very local farmers. So I think the issue is partly about investment, of course, and I'm sorry, Rachel, I'm not giving you a very good answer to your specific questions about the numbers, but about the institutions and the organizations which can make these investments result in sustainable agriculture.
Ruth, before I ask Avantika to also jump in there, Rachel's follow-up question also is actually right up your alley. She asks if you can expand on the commercial benefit of millets because the yield per acre is lower than rice. The market price is lower than rice as well, despite the fact that the cost of inputs, whether it's pesticides, fertilizers, etc., is comparable with paddy. So do you want to just comment on that before we ask Avantika to also jump in?
Yeah, sure. That is absolutely correct, Rachel. The yields are lower. These are small seeds. The yields are lower. They have not gotten the research investments that have increased the yields of rice and wheat so dramatically. So you are absolutely right. The yields are lower. If you look at this in terms of not just the output in terms of the tons, if you look at it in terms of the nutrients, the iron, the zinc, the micronutrients that are coming off of these fields, those yields are actually higher for millets. That doesn't really matter to the farmer because the farmer needs to make an income, obviously. So what we're seeing now is some movements towards including millets in the minimum support price structure so that farmers can get a good price for their millets and level that playing field somewhat. There are so many incentives, despite the high-level policy attention, so many incentives for farmers to grow rice and wheat, and it's quite a serious issue about how to overcome those incentives. Just one little response to your question also, we did an analysis a couple of years ago to see if there would still be enough production to feed the country and meet current levels of production if millets were to replace some of the rice production. And the answer is yes. And that is because in some parts of the country, certainly not Punjab, Haryana, the high yielding places, some parts of the country where the rice yields are actually very low. And those are the places where you might think about millets being somewhat on par with rice. But you're absolutely right. What really matters is the income that farmers are getting from growing different crops.
Thanks, Ruth. Avantika, do you also want to try and take a stab at that?
Yes, just to also first mention up front, I don't have a specific investment requirement or funding quantum for sustainable agriculture, but I can definitely share two data points that are a bit more macro, but maybe do give an indication of some sectors, though agriculture is very unique and very, very specific. So it's not necessarily indicative, but one estimate for India's climate finance needs that I can share is an estimate done in 2020, which found that India needs about 170 billion USD per year to achieve its climate target, which amounts to about $2.5 trillion till 2030. And on an annual basis, it has been receiving much less than that from international cooperation. And in fact, almost 70 to 90% of India's domestic climate action is being funded through domestic resources. So there's a lot of potential for international finance to play a bigger role. And a more recent estimate actually by Indian economists has found that India will require about $54 billion annually, or 1.3% of GDP, between 2022 and 2030 in climate finance. And this is focused specifically on some of the hardest to abate sectors such as steel, cement, power, and transport. So that gives you an idea of some of the ballpark numbers. But for agriculture, I think, I don't know if like a macro estimate has really been done on a large scale. I know adaptation numbers do exist, but from like an overall sustainable agriculture perspective, I don't have a specific number.
Sure. There's one more question for Ruth, from Mr. Jayaraman, but before we come to that, since we have allowed Sumit to sort of relax and enjoy this conversation for a while, let's go with one question for Sumit. Sumit, would you take the question about solar? The question is from VPF4's iPhone. I'm sorry, we don't know your name. Could someone speak to India's approach to solar, which is now more affordable than fossil fuels for energy production? China dominates the production of solar panels for now. Does India's fraught relationship with China complicate our adoption of solar and other things on the agenda at COP that can help with this? Sumit.
Sure. Thanks, Kavitha. Really enjoyed the discussions. And just on this, I think the deliberations on solars and the fossil fuel is always very critical at COP, right? The debate on fossil fuel per se. But then specifically on solar, I think, all countries hedges their way differently in a different manner, especially on these issues. And these issues are not something specifically discussed at the COP venue, or they don't have any specific agenda. While at the previous COP, there was some attempts to kind of, have a unilateral agenda or multilateral trades being included at SB as well as the last year's COP, where they would be discussing how the countries would be trading or are doing the bilateral trades among themselves, or through the carbon mechanisms that they would be trading among themselves. But that was outrightly rejected. So these debates among the countries usually happen bilaterally and everything else. Coming to the part on the solar bit, right? Certainly, solar has taken an edge in terms of the dominance in India, and the prices have come down. And yes, I do see, looking at from the geopolitical lenses, there might be an impact coming to, whenever there's a trade on solar panels and everything else happening, right? There might be an impact if ever there is a, relationships, are not really that great, there will be definitely an impact. But in terms of an agenda items, I don't see any specific agenda item being pointed out specifically on solar, but there are largely, agenda items which actually speaks about cooperation, technology sharing perspectives. And in all these debates, these things are discussed in a manner in which that how do we kind of facilitate technical learnings from each other, how we can promote more technological transfers among the countries, especially from the global north, from the global south. But there are other forums where these things are being discussed, like International Solar Alliance have come in, where they have been kind of deliberating about a lot more about deployment of the solar panels in the solar belt about it, where these things have been debated in those particular manner. So that's on one part. Do you also want me to take the withdrawal of US?
Actually, Avantika has a comment to make about solar, and subsequently we'll take the US question, and both of you would be answering it, and then we'll go back to Ruth, who will take the question about the villages or the urban communities. Avantika, comment on solar?
Yeah, just to also jump in and complement what Sumit said. So yes, through some of the recent tenders, there have been fairly low prices that are being discovered, particularly for solar and storage combined, and that's been the real catch. So some recent studies have said that the cost of building new coal is now higher than the cost of building new solar or wind. But typically, when you combine in battery storage with that, the costs rise exponentially and tend to not be viable yet. But recent tenders have discovered fairly low prices for solar combined with battery storage. But the question really is of scale over here. Ultimately, CSE just published a report on the coal power sector, analyzing the entire stock of thermal power plants in the country, and also looking at questions of power demand and other variables that impact how much coal we are going to end up actually needing and using. And the reality is that the scale of growth of our power demand right now is massive. We are it was expected that power demand would grow at somewhere between 5 to 7% in the coming years. In the post-COVID era, do we want to request him to mute?
I'm not interested.
Mr. Nimal Valipuram, please, if you could mute yourself.
Yeah.
Since it's being recorded, getting these comments and getting these sounds in between is just going to be difficult for us to transcribe later. Apologies, Avantika, please continue.
No worries. But what we are actually seeing in the post-COVID era, 2021 onwards, India's power demand has been growing at 9% per year, which is massive. So to cater to that scale of power demand growth for 1.4 billion people, you need a massive mix, firstly, a massive amount of energy and a massive diversified mix of energy sources. So the strategy that the government has adopted at this point is to add tons of renewable energy capacity, which doesn't equate to power generation from renewable sources, but massive amounts of capacity coming online to potentially meet the growing demand in the coming years. As a result of which, India just achieved one of its NDC targets this year, which is achieving 50% of non-fossil power capacity. And we've achieved this 5 years early. Now, what will it take to bring all of that capacity online and actually raise the generation of power from solar and wind? Currently, we are generating only about 12 to 13% of overall power from solar and wind. 75+% is coming from coal still, but this is expected to change. So the Central Electricity Authority has predicted that by 2030, the share of coal in our power mix is going to go down from 75% to about 55%. So a lot of the new power that is going to be generated to meet the new demand is expected to come from renewable sources. And that is what you're likely to see for a country with an upward moving trajectory of power demand. A lot of renewables, a certain amount of existing incumbent fossil sources, which today are, let's face it, coal is both a domestic endowment. Unfortunately, coal doesn't necessarily expose us to the volatility of the oil and gas markets, the way that we saw LNG suffering during the COVID era, where Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other countries weren't able to afford LNG shipments. So there is a certain security that coal is providing right now, but this is expected to go down in the future. So that's really behind the strategy of the Indian government. The China question looms large, and I'm taking a bit of time, I'll wrap up very quickly, but the China question looms large because China has just achieved massive economies of scale in every part of the solar manufacturing supply chain, right? From polysilicon to module production. But what India is increasingly doing is trying to give both domestic incentives and create a domestic ecosystem to produce more solar panels. Currently, we're doing a little more assembly than outright production from every stage of the supply chain. But as a result of the efforts domestically, our solar exports have been increasing. Interestingly, a lot of our solar panels are being exported to the US, which is very climate unfriendly right now. But there are efforts to kind of build our own domestic ecosystem for solar and try to build some self-sufficiency from that perspective. It remains a challenge because China has just achieved dominance in this field at this point. So yeah, I'll stop here and happy to answer any of the other questions as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Avantika. We'll go back to Sumit, and then you also jump in on the question about, that's from Richard. What effect do you see the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement having on COP30 and on future COPs? Sumit and then Avantika.
Thanks. Thanks, Kavitha. I think, firstly, I think US participation at COP has always been a bit more, aggressive in terms of positioning the global South voice very clearly, right? While the dominance has been, the US has always been there to kind of rejecting the proposals coming from the global South. So that was one thing I know. That's a good thing that, that one of the voices is lesser, to kind of rejecting the voices, right? So that is very clear. But if you look at it, even from the larger perspective, for the future COPs and everything else, US is only out from the Paris Agreement. It's not out from the convention. So there are many multilateral agreements going on parallelly at each COPs, right? One is the COP, which is actually, in which all countries are participating. And within the COP, there is a Paris Agreement that has come in, and within which the US is now out. So while US would not participate under the Paris Agreement, it can still largely participate on the other, climate agreements that is going on parallelly in the Kyoto Protocol or in the convention. But if the US itself decides that none of its delegations are going to participate at the COP venue itself, then they're not participating in the entire COP process, right? So certainly that's one kind of an impact where there will be less better. But US is also the money power, if you look at it, right? They bring kind of that much amount of money on the table. They also kind of bring a lot of, coalitions that comes into the place when these kind of negotiations have happened. So those would be a ripple effect, where they kind of, countries would look forward to the vacuum of leadership that might come in. And that's where, the other countries like EU has to step up, Germany has to step up, France has to step up. And so as India and China, as coming from the global Southeast, to kind of step up to bridge that vacuum. Yeah, so that's on one. On the other part of COP29 and India's pavilion and everything else, I think what I really see, pavilions, especially when it comes to the presidency and everything, is there are many parts to it and how a country kind of hosts a pavilion. Firstly, how's, India's bilateral relationship with that country is. With COP29, I think with Azerbaijan COP, I think the relationships was much more stringent towards were not that great. And anything in that space itself, the government of India would have decided that we will not go up and set up a venue or a pavilion or a side event of anything at the COP29 venue. While that is not the case, I don't see any of the at all the previous COPs that has happened, but especially for the Azerbaijan that have happened in that aspect, right? Yeah. So that would be my response.
Avantika, would you take that also briefly, and then we'll go back to Ruth on Mr. Jayaraman's question.
Yeah, I mean, the US has never been a particularly constructive actor in multilateral agreements.
Yep.
And I mean, at this point, the US exiting the Paris Agreement again is a huge blow for global climate goals because the US is still the second largest emitter. It's also a big blow because unfortunately, the US controls the dollar, which is the world's largest reserve currency, the prominent currency in global trade. And the US has control over global finance and capital as a result. So all of these make the absence of the US loom large. But I think the landscape is shifting quite a bit this year. From the beginning of this year, we have seen announcement after announcement announcing kind of the arrival of a different kind of, I would say, beast on the scene, which is the role of China as a new and prominent electro state, while the US kind of backslides and entrenches itself as a petro state. And China holding all of the technology and now a lot of the FDI for green technologies really has a very prominent role to play in the future energy transition for the rest of the global south. And a lot of developing countries are understanding this. They're entering into partnerships with China. They will do so with caution, especially countries like India, who are also competitors to China in many ways. So I think, yes, the US not being there, it's not surprising. It's a big problem for global goals. Others will have to work extra hard to ensure that we have some semblance of reining in of global temperatures. But in terms of who can really be the leaders going forward, BRICS, China, emerging economies, and of course, actors who are still in the game, like the European Union, really can shift the narrative and continue the climate conversations in a constructive way, I think.
Thanks, Avantika. Ruth, if you can quickly take this question about whether this engineering concept of a sillage, that is a city and a village, or urban, rural plus urban, do you see that as having an impact on bringing marginalized communities into the larger conversations about climate negotiations, about finance, about mitigation, adaptation, etc.? Do you see these interesting concepts that have emerged as being part of the solution, or at least part of the discussion?
Yeah. First, I want to say, Sumit, I love your optimistic view of the absence of the US having a positive impact of giving more space to global South voices. I'm sorry, that doesn't make me feel any better about the US position at this point. But that said, yes, this concept that comes from so many places throughout the world about having strengthened rural economies is really at the linchpin of being able to implement climate mitigation, implement climate adaptation. And as we work towards strengthening rural economies, or these smaller towns with rural areas and the resources coming from more rural areas, we have so many positive impacts for livelihoods, so that right now, so many rural farmers and need to migrate to the cities for livelihoods. We saw what happened during COVID, tragic. And just the sucking up of resources from these very large urban centers. And the more we work towards having more locally based or regionally based economies, the better off we will be, in my opinion, about having resources that don't deplete the local ecosystems and having better opportunities for livelihoods. Now, there's a balance there with having sort of thinking about complete subsistence, where you're only dependent on your local resources, which is another risk, because if there is an event such as a flood or a drought, of course you want to be able to get resources from elsewhere. But certainly in so many places in the US where we've seen hollowing out of rural economies leading to all of these political problems that we're seeing, and many, many places around the world, that working towards more integrated regional economies and supporting livelihoods can lead to improved climate adaptation, and maybe even improved implementation of mitigation measures if people see their benefit in their daily lives. So I'm not sure I answered your question very well, but I hope a little bit.
Moving on to the question from Axel, if Sumit and then Avantika can address it very, very briefly. We still have a couple of questions to go, so requesting you to keep your responses brief. The question is that in the summer, the Brazilian environment minister said that the presidency considers pushing for a roadmap to end fossil fuels at COP30. And is there a mood that is supportive about this in India at the moment? Is India ready to accept such a roadmap? Actually, maybe Avantika can go first, because you actually made some comments about coal already. Avantika, and then Sumit. And then we have a couple of broader questions. We want to move to those. So let's get through this one quickly. Avantika.
So, I mean, the roadmap to end fossil fuels, I mean, I have not heard of further traction on this. There are proposals coming from some parts of civil society around this, particularly in the context of the global stocktake outcome of 2023, which built in language around transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems. And there is a lot of concern that, you know, this goal was set in Dubai in 2023, and ever since then we have only been increasing fossil fuel production and consumption. And the UNEP's production gap report came out today, which actually shows supply side fossil fuel expansion is massive. I think for India, they will continue to remain very pragmatic on this and continue to balance their energy security interests along with their climate ambitions. There is a very clear understanding that there are many, many benefits that come with rapidly scaling up renewable energy. And there's a whole slew of domestic schemes ranging from solar incentives to EV subsidies that are attempting to achieve precisely this. But when you have a power system the size that India has, and 1.4 billion people to cater to at a time when our per capita power consumption is far below the world average, ending fossil fuels is difficult within this decade, but a gradual process of adding in more renewable energy while slowly reducing fossil fuels in the mix is the approach that India is likely to take. And that's what has really reflected in all of their policies and statements.
Sumit?
I would like to echo Avantika. And at the onset, while these high-level debates on fossil fuels, India has been very clear, right? It's a complete no from their side, given that the dependency is huge domestically on the fossil fuel debate. But domestically, what I see is that while whatever there has been statements on fossil fuel internationally, right? Domestically, the efforts has been to kind of decarbonize industries, decarbonize from the coal sectors, and that is itself a very good roadmap, which I think the ministry already has it, but they don't want to commit it internationally, given that the dependencies and the energy security debate that goes on is very critical for India's security point of view. So they would, I don't see this being accepted, even if that is being considered, but I don't see that being accepted at COP30 if it's being quoted. No, but
Great.
that's my viewpoint. But I think India's viewpoint, I can just speak over it.
Great. That's a very, very clear answer from both Avantika and Sumit over there. A broader question that all three speakers will ask all three of you to weigh in on this. We'll go with Ruth first, and then Avantika, and then Sumit. If you had to prioritize, the question is from Kanchi Dave. If you had to prioritize just a few of the SDGs at COP30 for India right now, which ones do you believe would deliver the biggest bang for the buck in terms of both immediate impact and long-term benefits? Maybe you can pick two each. What excites you most among the SDGs, Ruth?
Okay, what an interesting question. And I'm going to give an answer that is going to seem a little weird because they're not related to nature or ecosystems or even climate. I think the most important investments that societies can make is in education and health and nutrition. And with those two things, then we can aspire to all our other goals. But without education and healthy people, then where do we go as a society?
Thank you, Ruth. I think one of our participants has sent us a response reaction to that on the screen. Totally reflects what I feel also about your response. Thank you. That was really that we needed to have that comment in this discussion. Avantika and then Sumit, same question about the SDGs.
Yeah, very tough act to follow after Professor DeFries
Yes.
on that. But I'm in a tough position. But yeah, I don't know. It's very difficult to pick and choose policy priorities when you really need a kind of menu or package of solutions, or you need to basically throw the kitchen sink of solutions to kind of combine climate and development goals. So I'm giving you the very boring policy analyst response to this. But I think one of them that is very, very important, not to kind of undermine any of the other very, very crucial goals. But from the climate perspective, the question of perhaps affordable and clean energy, not just from a clean and decarbonized energy perspective, but also from a energy access and reliability and affordability perspective, remains very crucial for countries like India. We've only recently achieved almost 99% electricity coverage for households, but it's still not 24/7 coverage for all households. So I think ensuring that in a very just, fair, and clean way would be very key for climate goals.
Thank you. Sumit, will you go next?
Sure. And I would kind of echo both Ruth and Avantika. For me, if you look at it, capacity building is the key to kind of, tackle climate change, and hence to be enabling capacity building, one of the important part is education, right? Getting the right set of education to the people is really, really important. And obviously, when come from the India's point of view, energy access and affordable energy is another very important. But just to add to this, I've seen other SDGs such as industry is a part of it, right? Which is in which we have very hard to abate sectors such as talk about steel, aluminum, all those goods. All these are already a part of the climate actions in some form or other form. Whenever we talk about mitigation, it's action at the ground, and when we talk about action at the ground, it's about industries which are actually contributing to it, right? The other part is also about how do we consume responsibly. Currently, if you look at it, right, US and other global north are kind of I have the data sets with me. They have the highest rich person there are emitting 6 to 7 times more than the highest rich person in India or any global south countries, right? So that consumption pattern is too high. So I do see a clear-cut linkages of these SDGs that is already there to the climate change that is happening, but it's not like a clear-cut marrying. In some way or other way, these are addressed at a very higher level, at a very national level, in form of the commitments that countries are giving it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sumit. We've very efficiently gone through several questions, so we have time for a couple more, perhaps. We have a question from Unmek. I think, Avantika, this should be for you. How will the ICJ's advisory opinion impact the upcoming COP? Will it affect India's approach, considering that the court explicitly rejected the conservative interpretation of the Paris Agreement that India and many of the high-polluting nations set out? Avantika. I think Sumit also probably has a thought about it. So Avantika first and then Sumit.
I'll defer to Sumit, and I'll also say that I'm not a legal expert, but I'll share a link in the chat to a chat we had with 2 legal experts who were at The Hague just after the ICJ decision was announced. And you can definitely watch that discussion and possibly learn more from them that you can learn from me. So I'll share that link right now, and also defer to Sumit on this.
I'm not the legal expert to kind of comment on this, but there has been a lot of debate on this ICJ opinions and everything else. It's firstly, it's very welcoming, given the current nature of climate debate that's going on, no accountability and everything else. It's very welcoming. In some form or the way, there is some ruling that is holding some climate change accountable in some, right? To what extent it will be taken forward, that I don't think it will fly into that extent, because again, the agreements are not designed in that manner in which these outside, not while these are very formal and very important interventions being made, but these are again voluntary in nature. So they, to what extent it will be able to influence the formal negotiation process, that I'm not really, I'm not seeing that on an immediate basis per se, right? But in the long term, if the people are seeing or started holding, domestic climate actions accountable, obviously, when the domestic climate actions are being held accountable internationally, you're automatically accountable in that space, right? That's how I see it, but not from the top to down, but from the bottom up approach. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sumit. And Avantika, we will look forward to your link on that. I think it's something that all of us do want to learn a little more about. I also missed saying something that I wanted to earlier. Thank you to Kanchi for her previous question. I think that all of us really enjoyed listening to the answers that came from there. Thank you, Kanchi. We have time, I think, for one more question before we wrap up. Ruth, if you can take this one. The question is from Sumbul Munshi. How are you anticipating Indian non-state actor communities' level of engagement at COP30? So whether it's businesses, private sector, civil society organizations, philanthropies, what are some of the thematic areas where you think that non-state actors can advocate support for or build momentum around? Ruth.
Non-state actors, they are often, very present at the COPs. Not in the negotiating room, but in the surroundings and part of the conversation. And what we see from, like we saw from the private sector actors in past COPs, was for instance, commitments to reducing methane and other types of commitments to reducing deforestation, these kinds of commitments, which are very important. And I would expect that to continue, although because of the geopolitical situation, the pressure is a bit off of the private sector to make those kinds of commitments. But the real question, as Sumit has rightly brought to this conversation, is about the accountability. How do we have those commitments that are maybe made in good faith? How do we have accountability and ensure that those kinds of commitments are adhered to? And currently, I would say, I'm curious what Sumit might think, we don't really have a good system for that kind of accountability. And similarly to the others, to all of the other kinds of non-sector actors in the NGO space and the community representation, that it's great to have these discussions at COP, but where's the accountability and follow through?
Right. Thank you, Ruth. Sumit also has a thought about the NSAs. So, Sumit?
Yeah. So just quickly, building upon the accountability stuff and everything else. Do we have an idea of how many announcements and initiatives have happened over the last 10 years itself, since COP and COP, right? So I've been kind of looking into it, and there's something that we're looking into. There have been about 500 initiatives mostly, and out of these 500 initiatives, how many have achieved the targets and how many are still active. What I get a sense, especially at the COPs, countries or the actors, they do come up with high level mission, ambition, and everything else. While it helps in building the momentum at that particular point of time, what happens after that is we are clueless. We are clueless about is there any progress about it? Okay, and how do we take it forward? This year at the COP30 presidency, themselves have identified 6 axes across various pillars, and within these 6 axes there are 30 action agenda objectives, and they are trying to kind of nudge this exact point, right? What are how do we take account of the actions by the non-state actors, how the solutions from these non-state actors can be taken forward to a large scale, to the other regions per se, right? So they are kind of preparing a granary of solutions that would help kind of promote more regional solutions across the globe and bring the connect. They're trying to bring a much more accountable by creating a portal where these granary of solutions will be posted and where they will be tracked at a regular basis. So while these non-state actors are very, very important because they are the one player who are trying to bridge the NDCs. NDCs are nowhere near to 1.5, but NDCs do not actually relate to these actions committed to the non-state actors by all the by cities, by states, and everything else. So the way the actions by these non-state actors, they've been treated as a 4th pillar to the climate negotiations, mitigation, adaptation, finance. Then the actions by the non-state actors are now being considered as a 4th pillar. That itself shows the significance of these players per se. They do not really participate. While US is outside the negotiations, the actors, the non-state actors from the US are participating heavily to ensure that their contribution on climate actions remains significant. So that's how the politics of the climate actions actually prevail. How do we ensure that the political instability in one particular country is not there? Then the non-state actor plays a critical role there to kind of uplift that gap that is there. So certainly there are very, very positive trends in this in terms of it, but it again it lies at the realm of their own accountability, that how they're progressing so far. And COP30 is kind of trying to make ways or engage these actors in some capacity to, while this is again a voluntary nature, but to what extent they'll be held accountable is yet to be answered in near terms. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Sumit. That's all we have time for. I have the job of summarizing today's discussions, which is a little complex to do because they're broad and also deep at the same time. But just to remind everyone very, very quickly that Sumit, from the very beginning till the last line, has continuously kind of given us a rap on our knuckles for not being more clear-eyed about what to expect at COP30. He started off with saying that very sobering thoughts he had initially on that a lot of these discussions have been process-oriented, not result-oriented, and we must keep that in mind going forward towards COP30. Avantika has pointed out that although this COP30 does not have one broad headline kind of discussion or result to expect, the question of finance, and particularly finance for the global south, is looming large on all the discussions that will be held at COP30. And that India's role is critical because India has spoken very, very staunchly about Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, asking for public money in for the developed countries to put their money where their mouth is, and actually spend public money on climate finance, not private debt and private grants. Ruth has had a lot to say about not just agriculture and ecology, but also about marginalized people, communities, non-state actors, all of them, and their role in bringing unheard voices into climate negotiations at an international level. And the best part of it, of course, was everyone's thoughts about what are the top SDGs that we must be keeping in mind, keep on top of mind going forward. And thank you, Ruth, again, for reminding us that health and nutrition and education remain key to achieving a lot of the other SDGs also. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. That's all we have time for. Do engage with the Columbia University's Mumbai Global Center's material on their social media pages about COP30 going forward. There'll be a lot more work that we are doing. So do stay in touch and send us your questions if you have anything that you'd like us to take after this is over. Thank you very much. Have a very good evening, everyone.